Text Talks.
Hello everyone, this is Dr. Brian Black, and this week's Text Talk podcast is on Vedanta. Okay, so as usual, there is a group of PowerPoint slides to accompany today's mini lecture, and so now I refer you to slide number 2. So when we start talking about Vedanta, I think that we should start with the Upanishads. The word Vedanta literally means the end of the Vedas. And so in this way, the word Vedanta, in its first usage, when it was first used as a term, refers to the Upanishads themselves. Now, when we start thinking about the relationship of the Upanishads to later Indian philosophy, we should remember that the Upanishads themselves are anthologies. The Upanishads themselves are a number of different texts that include different teachings from different teachers. They're very philosophical in the sense that the Upanishads ask some of the most important philosophical questions that later Indian philosophers will continue to answer or try to answer for hundreds of years to come. However, they're not systematic as philosophy. In other words, what I mean by that is that the Upanishads don't have one single coherent philosophy, but rather seeds for a number of different philosophical trajectories. And in that sense, I think it's important to remember that even though there will later be an Indian school of philosophy called Vedanta, that this school is not the only one that will have been influenced by the Upanishads. So, literally, the Vedanta refers to the Upanishads, but as we'll see later, it refers to a philosophical school that bases itself on the Upanishads. On slide number 3, I have a long quotation from my entry in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the Upanishads. I'll let you read that on your own time, but the point here is to just emphasize the fact that the Upanishads influenced a number of different schools in Indian philosophy in different ways. But one of the schools that it will have its most lasting influence is the school that is later called Vedanta. Okay, in slide number 4, what I've done is I've listed the main schools of Indian philosophy. Now, there are a lot of different schools. There's oftentimes in introductory textbooks, you just see the classical paradigm of 6 schools. But I think it's also important to note that, that in addition to these 6 schools, there were other schools. Now, these schools are, in terms of the classic 6 schools, there's Samkhya, there's Yoga. Both of those schools would also be influenced by the Upanishads. There are other schools such as Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa. We're not going to be talking about these schools here, but I think it's important to see that that there were a number of different schools on the Indian philosophical landscape. And they also developed at different times. The Vedanta school was probably the last one to develop. I think it's also important to note from this slide is that these classical 6 schools are considered the Hindu schools, but these schools were always in contact with and in dialogue with schools from other religious traditions, such as the Jains, such as the Buddhists as well. Okay? Now, in slide number 5, I want to bring attention to a really important concept within Indian philosophy. I'm going to bring up a philosophical word here epistemology. Epistemology is a theory of knowledge. And so in Indian philosophy, pramanas refer to theories of knowledge. In other words, pramana means proof, or it means a means of knowledge. And the idea here is that there are different ways in which we know things, in which we can claim to, to have some sort of basis of knowledge for things. Now, the pramana theory, the idea that there are different ways of knowing things, was accepted widely amongst Indian philosophical schools. Not everybody accepted this, but almost every school did accept pramana theory, including Hindu schools, Buddhist schools, and Jain schools. Most Indian schools of philosophy accepted that there are three ways of knowing things. However, some accepted up to six. And of course, there's this one exception of one school, the Madhyamika Buddhist school, that didn't accept any at all. But in other words, we see that even though these different schools of Indian philosophy had different claims about reality, they agreed about some of their epistemological position. In other words, they agreed that there are three main ways in which we can claim to know something. And these three main ways are the first three of the pramanas listed at the bottom of this slide: perception, inference, and verbal utterance. As we'll see, having some sort of understanding of pramanas is key to understanding the Vedanta school and how it differentiated itself from other schools of Indian philosophy. Okay, so now let's go to our next our next slide, slide number 6. And what I've done here is I've listed again the main schools of Indian philosophy, including Jain and Buddhist schools. But here, rather than just naming the school, I've listed beside them the different pramanas that they accepted as being valid means for knowing something. Now, if you go down to the Vedanta school on this list, I put Vedanta in bold. You'll see that the Vedanta school tended to have 6 pramanas. So in other words, they recognized that there were 6 ways of knowing something. But you'll see in bold, I put way number 3, which is verbal utterance, or shabda. And one of the reasons I do that is that this particular pramana has particular importance within the Vedanta school of philosophy. So let's go to our next slide and try to understand what verbal utterance, or shabda, means. So basically, shabda means verbal utterance. That means, how do we know something is true? Well, from the Vedanta point of view, at least one way to know something is true is if we hear something from a reliable testimony. So, for example, we might think today, we might trust a doctor or a scientist as a valid means for knowing something. So I might not know certain things about medicine or science myself, but I might claim that that what I'm talking about is true because I have the testimony of an authority on that particular type of knowledge. Here we see on this slide J.N. Mohanty saying that there are some schools that didn't recognize Shabda as a pramana, but it's a major source of knowledge for most of the schools. Now, I've also quoted myself again from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy to point out that even though the original meaning of shabda means word, and therefore would refer to the reliable verbal testimony of an expert, very importantly, in Indian philosophy, shabda refers to scripture. So, in other words, it's not merely the word of an expert that we can count as true, but if a text is considered to be authoritative, i.e., shruti in the Hindu context, scripture, then we can claim that that what it says is true because it is based on authority. Okay, so we're going to come back to this particular importance that the Advaita Vedanta school puts on verbal utterance, shabda, in a moment. But let's just look at slide number 8, because one of the things that I want to bring attention to here is how important the pramana theory was in Indian philosophy, especially in the practice of debate. One of the ways in which we might see the Upanishads as a precursor to later Indian philosophy is not merely in terms of many of its central ideas about concepts such as Atman and Brahman and moksha and karma. But in addition to that, we see that the Upanishads recount practices of Indian philosophy. One of those practices we'll see later is yoga, but here I'm focusing on the practice of debate itself. Now, in later Indian philosophy, when we have different philosophers debating against each other, very interestingly, they would agree upon which particular pramanas they were going to acknowledge as being a valid means of debate in their particular debate against each other. So, for example, one of the things we've seen is that different schools of Indian philosophy actually subscribe to different pramanas. But let's say one school only recognized 2 pramanas and another school recognized 4 pramanas. When they would debate against each other, they would agree beforehand which pramanas they were allowed to refer to in this particular debate. It's very interesting then that one of the implications of this is that 4 different philosophers of different schools to debate against each other, they had to understand their opponent's views as well as their own views. I think that's a very interesting thing to reflect upon when we think of so many political and public debates today. Oftentimes, I think we see today that different politicians or different philosophers who are arguing against each other in the public sphere seem to be just talking past each other, over each other's heads. Within this within the pramana theory of ancient India, you couldn't do that, though, because every time you're debating against somebody, you have to agree beforehand what types of arguments are valid. Anyway, I'll let you reflect upon that further. Let's return to, though, Vedanta and the importance of the pramana of verbal testimony in their philosophy. Okay, so basically the Vedanta school divided up the Vedas into 2 sections. They said one section was the Karma Kanda, which was the section of ritual, basically, and the other was the Jnana Kanda, the section of knowledge. And basically, they argued that all the Vedas are true, all the Vedas are authoritative, but they took most of their arguments from the Upanishads, the section of the Vedas that they considered to be the section about knowledge. Now, there were three texts or groups of texts in particular that the Vedanta school considered to be reliable in terms of Shabda, in terms of making their philosophical claims. Now, importantly, as we've already talked about, the Upanishads. And so here we see that the Upanishads now, from the Vedanta onwards, are not just kind of influential texts on Indian philosophy, but they're considered authoritative texts. And one of the things we'll see is the Vedanta school will make its arguments from its close reading of the Upanishads. Now, we might argue that the Upanishads continue to be the most important of these three core texts. However, it's also important to remember that there were other texts. One, the Brahma Sutra, which was it's the oldest systematic interpretation of the Upanishads. It was composed sometime between about 200 BCE and 200 CE. And another text that you're probably familiar with, the Bhagavad Gita. So these are the three textual sources that the Vedanta school is referring to when they're making an argument based on pramana. Now, just to complicate things further, we have to recognize that within the Vedanta school, there are three main branches. One is Advaita Vedanta, which means unqualified non-dualism. That means that it's monism, that the truth is ultimately one. And the main teacher from that school is the teacher by the name of Shankara. He lived sometime around 700 CE. He argued for the complete unity of Atman and Brahman. Now, there are two other types of Vedanta. One is called the Vishishta Dvaita Vedanta, and this is qualified non-dualism. The most famous teacher from this school was Ramanuja. He used the Upanishads to argue that Atman is not identical with Brahman, but an aspect of Brahman. He also argues that the Upanishads are a source of bhakti, or devotion, and he identifies the Upanishadic Brahman with God. And then we also have Dvaita Vedanta, which is a Vedanta school of dualism. And the main proponent of this school is a philosopher by the name of Madhva. He interpreted Brahman as an infinite and independent God. Now, what these three schools, or what these three branches of Vedanta all have in common is that they place the same importance on the pramana of Shabda. In other words, they all claim that that textual sources, that scripture is a main authority for knowledge. However, they have different interpretations of what scripture is. Now, if we look at slide number 11, we'll look a little bit more detail at Advaita Vedanta. We might say that of all the branches of Vedanta, that this one is the most well-known and has the most influence. Now, the main teacher, the kind of founding teacher of the Advaita Vedanta school is Shankara Acharya. He's probably the most famous Hindu philosopher. Interestingly, he probably remained unknown for about 2 or 3 centuries after his lifetime, and he was sort of discovered later as his school became more famous. According to Shankara, the fundamental teaching of the Upanishads is that Atman and Brahman are one and the same, that there is absolutely no difference between them. He also, another term that's important in Shankara's philosopher is avidya, which means ignorance. He argues that the appearance of multiplicity in the world is due to a misunderstanding, an ignorance as to the way the world really is. So, in other words, there's no contradiction between, say, the one and the many, because all our perceptions of the many are a misperception. Ultimately, from a ultimate reality point of view, the world is one. And so he argues that even though it might seem that Brahman is more than one, that Brahman appears to change, it actually does not. Now, throughout his philosophy, Shankara bases a lot of his arguments on scripture. So, for example, he argues, one of the things that he argues very interestingly is that even though there are a number of different pramanas, and all of these pramanas can provide a sort of valid source of knowledge, that different pramanas have different spheres. So, for example, if you want to know that fire is hot, or if you want to know that fire will burn you, you can rely on your senses. You don't need to read the Upanishads to learn that fire is hot or that fire will burn you. However, according to Shankara, if we want to understand the highest knowledge, the knowledge about ultimate reality, then we cannot rely on our senses. We cannot rely on other pramanas such as inference or comparison. Rather, for Shankara, when it comes to questions about ultimate reality, the only valid source of knowledge is Shabda. So here we see that on the one hand, the Vedanta school generally recognizes a number of different pramanas. But on the other hand, when it comes to the most important claims of the school, they highlight one pramana above and beyond all others. And that pramana is Shabda, or reliable authority, or in this case, scripture. So he argues the only way we can truly know something about ultimate reality is if it is stated in one of the three authoritative texts of the Vedanta school. Okay. Furthermore, he argues that Shruti is not to be doubted. It is infallible, and no argument or justification is necessary for the validity of Shruti. One of the ways we might understand of what's going on here is we can see that with Advaita Vedanta, Indian philosophy takes a rather major turn. Before Advaita Vedanta, we didn't see such sort of theological or scholastic claims. Most of Indian philosophy before Shankara was much more based on arguments from other pramanas. Whereas from Advaita Vedanta onwards, not only does the Vedanta school make arguments according to, based on Shabda or scripture, but As other schools try to argue against them, they tend to make more arguments from Scripture as well. Now, I just have one more slide, number 13, on the importance of the Upanishads in understanding Shankara's philosophy. Another important doctrine, according to Shankara, was what he calls the Mahavakya, or these sort of great sayings of the Upanishads. And so there are a number of sort of quotations that he refers to again and again that he basically says are sort of summarizing the ultimate points of Vedanta philosophy. Also, through Shankara's work, he provides a way of reading the Upanishads. It's not merely that he says that the Upanishads say certain things, but he also justifies his arguments by the way in which the Upanishads say what they say. So, for example, Shankara doesn't claim to be an original thinker, but a reformer. He argues that he is only maintaining what was already says. And he also argues that he does not develop philosophical position for their own sake, but rather for the purpose of guiding the listener or reader to the truth of Brahman. What he sees is textual authority as a pramana is the process of gradually stripping away one's ignorance and one's contradictions until one arrives at the truth. Now, one of the things I think we see today, especially in a lot of modern interpretations of Indian philosophy, is that a lot of modern interpretations of Indian philosophy tend to think of Indian philosophy generally as Vedanta, rather than sort of recognizing the great diversity of Indian philosophy through India's history. I think one of the big reasons why Vedanta has become so sort of dominant in terms of representing Indian philosophy, especially outside of India, is because of reformers in the 19th and 20th century like Swami Vivekananda. So if you look at slide number 14, you can see that Swami Vivekananda, who was really one of the first Hindus to speak about Hinduism and Indian philosophy in a Western context, himself ascribed to the Vedanta school. As he said, the Vedanta philosophy really comprises all the various sects that now exist in India. Usually by the word Vedas in India, the Vedanta is meant. Now, other Indian philosophical schools might disagree with that, but here we see that Vivekananda presents all of Indian philosophy very much from a Vedanta perspective. Remember, Vivekananda is talking in the context of the colonial period in India and very much arguing for Indian independence. And for Vivekananda, an independent India begins with reviving its ancient traditions. One of the things he argues is, in order to get strength and eventually nationhood, Hindus had to appeal to their ancient Sanskrit texts, such as the Upanishads. As he says, strength is what we want, and the first step in getting strength is to uphold the Upanishads. And then in another context, he says, all that we call ethics and morality and doing good for others is also but the manifestation of this oneness, summarized in the Vedanta philosophy by the celebrated aphorism or Mahavakya, Tattvam Asi, thou art that. And so here we see a sort of modern interpretation of Indian philosophy that kind of interprets all of Indian philosophy and religion in terms of Vedanta. On our final slide, I have two quotations from one of Vivekananda's speeches at the World Parliament of Religion in Chicago in 1893. One where he talks about Vedanta in particular, and another where he talks about the Upanishads. Okay, so I'm going to end there. I'll let you look at those quotations on your own time. But just summing up, the word Vedanta literally means the end of the Vedas. It literally refers to the Upanishads. But centuries after the Upanishads, there emerged a philosophical school called Vedanta that claimed the Upanishads as their sort of source of knowledge, as the source of their main doctrines. Now, I have a few more slides here. I have 2 slides of discussion quotations from the Upanishads and Shankara for you to sort of reflect on some of the things that I've said so far. And I also have a group of discussion questions to try to understand more about pramanas. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to talking to you next week on our next text talk subject.